Hello. There are some games that don't just stand the test of time, they define it. The games against which all others are measured. HeroQuest is one such game, and its designer, Stephen Becka, would go on to make many other classics as well, from Battlemasters and Space Crusade to Havoc and Heroescape, and he is still working today on some incredible new games. I got the chance to chat with Stephen about his design philosophy, the making of HeroQuest and Space Crusade and Battlemasters, and it was an incredible conversation. I had so much fun, and I think you are going to have a lot of fun as well as we explore Stephen Becka's career, the behind-the-scenes creation of those incredible games, and how everything came together to change board gaming as we know it. I'm Jordan. This is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with game designer Stephen Becka. Stephen, thanks so much for joining me. I like to start just by getting an understanding of the beginning of your journey. So, where did you first become a gamer?
So for me, it all goes back to my passion for military history, toy soldiers, and model making as a kid. So obviously, growing up in the UK in the sort of the late 60s, early 70s, as a young kid, I would make Airfix toys. I would collect my sort of HOOO sort of toy soldiers, and I enjoyed painting them. And I enjoyed, setting them up in little scenes. And my friends would come over and we would play very simple games of lining up our soldiers and knocking them down either with marbles or, throwing small bricks at them. But that would knock the paint off. So I created a very, very simple set of rules. I said, okay, rather than throw things, let's roll some dice and let's have some simple rules that I can move a soldier this far, and if he's got a pistol he rolls one die, and if he's got a machine gun he rolls three, and it was all super basic. And then one day my dad went to the library, and he came across a book by Charles Grant called The War Game, that on the front cover has a whole line of painted toy soldiers, and he thought, oh, this might be something that Steve would be interested in. So he brought me that book back from the library, and that was it. That was the beginning of me, being enlightened to the fact that, wait a minute, this is a thing. It's like people actually do this, and they've written books about it. And, particularly with the War Game, which is, this book here, um, you know, and again, I had this on permanent loan for the library, probably for at least 2 years before I was able to get my own copy. Um, and then, in particular, because I loved the Napoleonics, I then got Charles Grant's book on the Napoleonic wargaming, and this is what excited me, right? I mean, this is the kind of image that, modern day wargamers see all of the time. People coming into the hobby these days have a massive, rich universe of photography and image and miniatures from, Games Workshop or, Warlord Games or whomever it might be. For me as a kid growing up in the 70s, right, it's like this is it. This, and then magazines like Military Modeling and Battle for Wargamers, people like Charles Grant, Donald Featherstone, Tony Bath. This was the world that that really excited me, right? So that, and in particular with Charles Grant, what's great about this book in particular is he walks through the history. He talks about the organization of the regiments and how he's now going to interpret that into the game by applying a figure ratio or a ground scale. He would look at the rate of fire and the ranges for certain types of weapon platforms. And to me, it sort of just made me realize it's like, wait a minute, this is kind of a a light simulation. It's like I can make a game on anything I want. So I designed racing games for all of my little Matchbox cars, right? I designed, a naval battle game to go with all of my die-cast warships. I mean, it was really fascinating for me. And when I look back on it, and again, we'll touch on this as we talk further, is there were sort of several factors here that really were influential. One is what I aspired to was the visual spectacle, right? As soon as I saw this, games that didn't have great art and miniatures or didn't give you the opportunity to paint them, it became far less interesting. Second is that none of these games that I was enjoying were written on the basis of this is it, it's written in stone and nothing can be changed, right? They all kind of encouraged you, or at least left the doorway open to you saying, you know what, I really like all of this, but I don't like that rule. Or this is great, but they haven't included rules for this type of troop. So I'm going to add that in myself, right? So the ability that the game is fungible, the game is customizable, right? Um, and the third thing, most importantly, is these are simple. I very quickly, as I, got excited into wargaming, started realizing that, hey, there are other companies out there that do, war game rules, but almost universally, most of those just became more complex. And in becoming more complex, they didn't necessarily deliver a better or different experience. They just slowed the experience down,
Hmm.
right? So I universally have, been more attracted to a simple game that you can customize that creates what I call the theater of play, right? Which is the immersive 3D environment that brings to life whatever it is that you are imagining that you're doing.
Right. Right. Amazing. Yeah. So, and I'm sure we'll explore some of that as we progress. But so you'd gone from that sort of early days. You're exposed to this world of gameplay and the opportunity to sort of simulate these battles. Where did that then take you as you were sort of growing up and moving into the world of work? How did that kind of become a part of that journey?
So, so basically, it opened me up to the world of gaming, right? And friends and family obviously knew that I was a game player. And again, this is in the early days of what we would now call hobby gaming, right? I mean, no one talked about hobby gaming back then. People would talk about being a war gamer or maybe a role player. Um, and of course, from that, I kind of got invested in some of the board war games that were being done, games by Avalon Hill or, Victory Games or SPI. They were a little bit sort of more involved. But I remember, titles like 1776 by Avalon Hill. I had a friend of mine who would play that game with me fairly regularly. And, I've still got the game downstairs with a couple of pieces of paper that record all of the positions that we had on the last time we paused the game for play. Um, and then of course it led into role playing. So I had my own sort of role play group, and developed my own role playing world. But basically, I just got into more and more sort of history, sort of areas for wargaming. The English Civil War was a favorite of mine, the Napoleonics, World War II. And I was lucky I had a couple of friends at school and going into college who were into the same thing. So, had a ready source of passionate adversaries to fight against.
Oh, fantastic. And then at some point you found yourself working in Games Workshop, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is growing up, I never for a moment thought that I would become a games designer or that I would get into the toy and game industry. Growing up, I was interested in um, aviation for a long, long time. I had dreams of, being in the RAF and being a fighter pilot. When I was in the Scouts, I was in the Air Scouts. We would go flying, once a month. We would help out with sort of crowd duties at air shows like Biggin Hill. But, ultimately, as I sort of, came out of college, I did, my sort of hopes and dreams of joining the RAF kind of like fell by the wayside. And I actually went and worked at NatWest Bank. And again, it's like, the thought of being in the game industry didn't really occur to me. However, um, one of the folks that I used to role play with had a job as a store assistant at Games Workshop in Hammersmith, and I was located at the Hammersmith branch of NatWest Bank. So on a lunchtime, I could walk a few blocks down the road, hang out with my buddy, talk to the guy who managed the store. Um, and then at the weekends, I would go and work at Games Workshop, and I'd earn myself an extra 15 quid and get a discount and be able to buy some games. Um, and then about after, I think about a year, it just so happened that my friend moved on. There was an opportunity to go full time and work at Games Workshop, um, which I jumped at because it was like, hey, I get to work in a game store, I get to see new games when they come out. Um, you know, Parents and friends were somewhat horrified that I was giving up a job in the bank to become a store assistant at a games shop. And again, we have to think in the context of the time, right? That working for one of the major high street banks in the mid 80s was considered a job for life and job security for life. And it's like working in a bank is about as stable as, it can be versus working in a fringe game shop sounds very sort of risky. Um, but I was following my passion. It was, it was what I wanted to do. And then, as luck would have it, um, within I think it was about 6 months or so, the guy who was managing the store was promoted and moved to a new Manchester branch. And I was given the chance to manage the store, at which point, whilst it was still somewhat risky, I was now at least the store manager, and that made it, a sort of a more viable, career opportunity. And then, as it happened, that also, ended up being the catalyst that ultimately led to me working at Milton Bradley.
Sure, yeah, because well, I believe that there was a fateful phone call, but how long had you been at Games Workshop before you got that call?
So, I believe I'd been there for about sort of 14 months or so. I
Right.
mean, I'd been at Games and I'd been working for them, um, at the weekends for a year or so beyond that. So at this point, it's like I'd been, 2.5 years at Games Workshop,
Mm.
in some capacity. Um, and basically, I got a call out of the blue from someone who was looking to get some wooden playing pieces made because, uh, again, pre-internet, looking in the phone book, Games Workshop sounded like a woodworking studio that made high-end chess pieces.
Sure.
Um,
Which, of
and
course, they started out doing more or less,
Right,
right? So,
right. So it's again it kind of just worked to my advantage, and thankfully. Um, the call sort of evolved into a little bit of a sort of a question and answer and what have you. And coming out of all of that, I was asked if I would be interested in, going to their offices and helping them play test some games, which I said, yeah, that sounds great. So I took a busman's holiday of 3 days and went and sat in the offices at Milton Bradley, and they put me in a room and brought me a number of games, and I read through them and wrote up what I thought. And even simple things like some of the games use polyhedral dice, which were not widely known at the time, right? I mean, again, today they're very commonplace. Most people have seen them and sort of know of them. But again, back in those days, there was one game in particular that was a stock market game that used 12-sided dice to sort of create random fluctuations in the stock prices. And there were a couple of folks at Milton Bradley who had never seen a 12-sided dice before, and I was like, oh, just like these are very common, and it gives you a different range of possibilities. And long story short, at the end of those 3 days, I was asked to meet with Roger Ford, who is the vice president of design, and he said, look, you have a great passion for games, you know a lot, we really value all of your sort of, thoughts and comments. Have you ever considered working for a games company, and would you be interested in working for us? And of course I said yes. And that was it. I mean, so again, I think I've always looked back on this, and what I always reflect to people is you can't always know where it is you're going because you don't necessarily know what destinations are available. But you have to just kind of like follow your heart and follow your passions and do what you enjoy. Because I think if you do that, you put yourself in a situation where opportunity can happen, and you can then take advantage of that or not, but just remaining where you are and doing something because you feel you have to rather than you want to isn't, I think, gives you less chance that opportunity is going to come your way. So again, I always look back at it and say, hey, it took a chance working at Games Workshop, and it led me down the path that it did.
Yeah, I mean, incredible there, and just not necessarily a roll of the dice, but you were putting yourself in the room to be able to take a turn, I guess, in a way,
Yeah.
right? But can you remember? So it sounds like they were literally just looking for these wooden parts for very traditional games. That so they were sort of still MB was producing the same kind of games it had up until that point, right?
Yeah.
Right, and then they
Yeah. So
well, I was going to ask if they brought you in with a view to we're working on this new like dungeon style game. Can you come and help on it? Or were you brought in and it was like, right, what ideas have you got?
So I think they were looking for someone who just had more of a sort of an insight and experience with games in a broader sense, right? So at the time, for the most part, the European office at Milton Bradley, which was based in Richmond, localized games that were initially designed and developed in the United States. So now there were some games that were developed in the European office. Roger Ford himself sort of took a strong hand in some of the early design of plastic games like Battleships and Hangman and stuff like that. But when you look at other games, like, for example, the first edition of Thunder Road, right? Thunder Road was a game that was designed in Europe, in the US. And then when it came to Europe, it had to be localized. So a large part of the role of the European office was to take American games, get them translated, update and adapt them as necessary, so that they could be launched into the various European languages. And as soon as I joined, or very shortly thereafter, I began to campaign for, hey, I got a couple of ideas on some games we could do. I certainly think that we should be doing something, to take advantage of the rising trend and popularity of various forms of fantasy gaming. And again, at the time, there had been some early what we would now think as more hobby-like product coming out of the US in the Games Master series, right? So you had Axis and Allies, you had Conquest of the Empire, Fortress America. These were games that significantly stepped outside of the traditional Milton Bradley mass market kid family targeted game. These were games that had a lot more substance and depth and strategy to them, were in bigger boxes and were a higher price point. And I had seen some of these come to market when I was at Games Workshop. And again, in my mind, it's like, hey, look, here are some indicators, right? It's like globally, Hasbro or Milton Bradley has done some games that kind of, venture into this space. I gave I used to have a number of chats. Roger Ford would often ask me to come have lunch with him in his office, and we would just talk. I mean, he was very much a mentor to me. He really was obviously the person that hired me, but he also taught me a lot in my early years about thinking broadly around a project and thinking about the target audience and the sort of the more sort of rounded experience that a game sort of offers. So I would talk to him about fighting fantasy and how popular those books had become. I was looking at things like the increased circulation for magazines like White Dwarf or Dragon magazine. There were lots of indicators. Dungeons and Dragons was getting more press. And I said these are all indicators that there's an opportunity with this sort of groundswell of interest in fantasy gaming, and that's really what began the whole dialogue and journey that ultimately led to HeroQuest and the collaboration with Games Workshop.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because it feels like HeroQuest was quite a departure in many ways for MB. It doesn't seem like something they were looking at prior to your work on it. But so was that like a tough sell then? I mean, I know you're saying there's indicators across the market. This could be an area that we move into, but to go into to produce a game like HeroQuest, to collaborate with Games Workshop, produce loads of miniatures, loads of plastic in there. It feels like that would have been a tough one to get across the line. So what was the appetite like, I suppose, within MB for it?
So it was, so again, this is where sort of fortune sort of played its part, right? So I had developed I had begun the process of developing a concept. The early concept was would be much more recognizable in today's world, right? There were character classes that had a little bit more flexibility to how the characters could evolve. There were multiple hit points. There was more of a traditional dungeon master. I had dungeon tiles. There were more cards. I was trying to create a simplified version of a role-playing game. And there was interest, but I wouldn't say it was strong interest. I think there was a lot of concern over just what was going to be required to execute and launch a game like this. And there had been some talk about the fact that, hey, well, we could, reach out and work with other companies. And it was at this point that there was an American businessman who had previously worked at Hasbro, who basically came along and ventured that we should be working or we should be talking with Games Workshop. And again, in business, there is, a business model where someone who is a third party who sees an opportunity for two other companies to work together will basically broker a deal with the view that, if there is a deal, it's like they get a little bit of a, compensation for that. And that's what sort of happened, right? So this introduction was made. of course, when the introduction was made, the fact that I was X Games Workshop kind of gave me a seat at the table in some early dialogue, particularly given the fact that we had some initial work on a game. And basically that was the catalyst, right? All of a sudden that created an advantage and a sense of security for Milton Bradley because, well, here's a trusted name in the space of fantasy gaming. They can do the miniatures, they can support us and give us something that sort of lends significant credibility to what we're doing. For Games Workshop, it was, well, here's an opportunity for us to sell games to a much, much broader audience than we typically launch. And if people who play this game like it, we're the obvious next step in their gaming journey, right? So it was a win-win for both parties. And following that, we went through a sort of a short process where we looked at various approaches for the design. I had begun to remodel the design that I was working on to include a game board because that was easier to manage. And I'd also started to strip out a lot of the complexity. Games Workshop had a concept which we also looked at, which used high density expanded polystyrene tiles that were in hexagons that had an inset in the middle into which you could put sort of like a piece of cardboard that would give you the colored play space. And then these hexagons could be arranged in different ways and give you different configurations for the dungeon. At the time, Games Workshop were using that manufacturing process for a range of projects, such as the Mighty Fortress, the early Blood Bowl game, playing fields used that same high density expanded polystyrene. Part of the challenge with it is it didn't fit as a manufacturing process with how Milton Bradley at the time was sort of set up to manufacture. They had factories in Germany and Spain and Ireland, and those were the places that they would want to make a game. But also, importantly, it didn't provide the same breadth of variation and the ability to kind of customize and have unique scenarios and a sense of individual narrative, which is ultimately, the direction that we ended up going with and what ultimately became, HeroQuest as we know it.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, because I'm just trying to picture what that might have looked like then. So these different sort of hexagonal tiles, essentially, and you're inlaying different card like tile. So you kind of got two levels of tile to create one playing space.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically if you imagine a hexagon, and I seem to remember they were about sort of 8 inches across, something like that. But then the inner part of the hexagon and the middle part of each wall is recessed down. So you've basically got 6 pillars in each of the apexes. And then into the center area, you could sort of push fit a bit of lightly die cut cardboard sheet that would be full printed, right?
Right.
So then that hexagon becomes a sort of a permanent, thing that you can rotate and line up with other hexagons. And it was a sort of a fairly, again, straightforward game, but it didn't provide quite the same range of opportunity for sort of customizing and creating what felt like more unique narratives. Part of the initial sort of design sort of approach that I took with HeroQuest is when I first decided to go from individual tiles to a game board. It was to create a layout that gave me a mix of room sizes and sort of adjacent sort of proximities that would allow me to tell different stories, right? So, and again, the original board was a 3-panel board, which had to get cost reduced. It was it was an Axis and Allies game board, right? That had the 2 folds and the 3 panels, but that had to be cost reduced down to the board that we know. But in particular, when you look at it, it's like I knew that I wanted to have at least one large room for kind of like, boss battles. I knew that I wanted 2 smaller rooms that could either be cells or they could be like little sort of, secret door sort of closets or chambers off of another room. I wanted a board that, allowed for like long corridors as well as some wider corridors. And the game board that we know today sort of went through multiple iterations before I found something that I felt gave me the balance. And again, as we know, what's nice about it is when you put the starting tile out on a HeroQuest board, you have no idea what parts of that board are going to be unlocked or not. It also massively supported, the entry into the game, because setup is basically sort your characters out, Morcar or Zargon, takes his or her seat, open the game board and put the starting stairs out, and you're basically ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that discovery of the board is very similar to laying down the tiles, isn't it? But you're doing it in a more constrained way. But it often puts me in mind this kind of thing of that almost necessity is the mother of invention, right? Because, like you say, if you started with that 3-panel board, the bigger board, that would have really changed the nature of the game. It might, like an individual quest might have taken a lot longer to play. It might not have been as accessible. It might have been more intimidating. So almost the cost reduction resulted in a beneficial change there.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's interesting because what I have learned, over the years is to embrace constraint. So to your point, when you are faced with a limitation, don't waste energy, agonizing over it. Embrace it and ask yourself, what does this provide in terms of a stimulus or an opportunity to do something different? So, for example, you've probably heard the phrase, people talk about it a lot, of sort of like think outside the box. I prefer optimize the box, because you're always in a box, right? Doesn't matter how much you want to wish that you're in a world where you can do whatever you want. There's usually always some kind of a limitation. And the faster that you can know what that is, so that you can innovate within it, or to accommodate it, the better off you are. And that was a classic example, right? We couldn't afford the bigger board. It got cut down to 2 boards. As I look back on it, it didn't really change anything, right? Because I probably was never going to use the whole board in one quest, just because there isn't enough furniture and doors to go around to kind of unlock an even bigger game board. And to your point, it would just add more journey time between destinations within a quest. And so it probably was a good thing.
Yeah, really super interesting. And then so you're sort of designing the game. I mean, obviously, in terms of using tiles originally, that would go on to be something that Games Workshop themselves would trial out with their advanced HeroQuest that sort of came out shortly later, wasn't it?
One of the other factors in early development on HeroQuest that I had considered was having cards that would have no illustration, and the illustration would be completed by you collecting panini stickers and putting those stickers onto the card. And depending upon the sticker that you chose, it would change how that card would operate within the game, right? Because at the time, panini stickers, like Fighting Fantasy, was a huge phenomena in the UK, right? And I talked about this with, the marketing team. I talked about all of the sort of the benefits. Um, Even in some of my, I have to find where I put my book now, but even in my early designs, um, I had sort of like laid out some thoughts for, you know, where, you know, where the stickers would go and how this would be
Right.
on your sheet. Um, and again, this is all was all a part of me thinking about how do you have elements within a game that build off of what someone already understands or is familiar with, right? Because again, that's a that's a key part, right? For all creatives, which is if you do something that is 100% unique, it's a much harder sell. It's not that it's and it's likely way harder to do, right? It's the pinnacle of creativity. You're breaking new ground, and I'm not dishing it by any means. But it's far easier for me to say, "Hey, I've written a new story. Imagine this. It's about cowboys, but there are aliens." It's like, okay, boom, I get it, right? I've taken what is known and I've put that little twist on it, right? And I don't really have to say much more than that for your brain to explode and for you to kind of get what I'm talking about. Now, it's still on me to do all of the heavy lifting and kind of make that a plausible experience for you to enjoy. Um, but again, it's like, you know, collectible stickers were a big thing at the time. And interestingly, the legacy of that, it did exist at some point because there was the HeroQuest Panini sticker book
Of
that
course.
came out, right? So, it's it at least in part sort of saw its way into a finished product.
Yeah, and that's a really fun idea though as well, like the collectability aspect, but then the modification of the base game. I mean, almost slightly kind of presages the sort of legacy game style of modifying your game permanently by
Right,
adding these sticker elements.
right, exactly. And and again, it goes back to my experience as a war gamer. For the most part, most war game rules at the time did not come with prescribed miniature lines, right? It's like, here's a set of Napoleonic rules. It's like, go buy your figures from, Hinchcliffe or from, Minifigs or whoever you want to, do that with. It was Games Workshop or Citadel Miniatures, Brian Ansell and others who really led the way in like, well, no, here's a set of rules and here's a set of miniatures to go with them, right? And started to create the package. Um, so in my mind, the fact that you could customize things has always been a desirable part of any gaming experience.
Mm. But the continued development on HeroQuest itself, where did that go next? So you're sort of working towards this board. You know you're doing this collaboration with Games Workshop. I mean, how did it then get to it's going to look like this and it's going to play in this way?
So basically, once I had sort of got the new game board sort of organized, um, I went up to Games Workshop and I took the early prototype and I sat down with a bunch of their designers and we played through sort of two of the early quests. Essentially to get Games Workshop on board with the game approach. The deal with Games Workshop basically said that Milton Bradley would be responsible for developing the game and marketing the game. Um, Games Workshop would be responsible for providing the sculpts, the miniatures, as well as providing a certain amount of in-game art. And obviously, the support and the insights of their team. So when you look at the game, all of the game art on the cards was managed by Games Workshop. They did all of the sculpting for the miniatures, But the game board, the furniture art, the box top, that was all art directed by, myself working with third parties on the outside. And, Games Workshop had visibility to that. That was certainly part of the process, but that was managed, by the Milton Bradley team.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And was that, is Games Workshop are doing the miniatures? Were they casting those miniatures, or were they like the injection molding, or was that being done by MB?
Yeah, that was all done by Milton Bradley.
Right.
So basically, um, Games Workshop at the time would sculpt the original miniatures, and again, I mean, I had wanted slightly more in the way of individual sculpts. I had wanted slightly more in terms of the way of unique spot art and the cards, but had to work within the constraints of what Games Workshop felt was viable in terms of what they could afford as part of the deal in terms of the total number of unique sculpts, total number of pieces of art, all of which is completely understandable. And again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is there's always constraints, right? I mean, you're always going to start every project with, hey, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And then you realize that actually, no, we can only afford this much art. We can only afford these many sculpts. It's like, okay, how do I work with that? So simple things like, you know, there's one sculpt for the orc, but there's a number of flavors because we swapped out the weapons, right? Simple things that provided a little bit of additional variety without the full cost of a brand new miniature. Once those sculpts were done, and they were all done 3 up, so they were sculpted 3 times the normal size, because back in those days, the manufacturing process required that we would send those oversized sculpts to the tool maker. The tool maker that would then pantograph them down to the actual size. And that was then used to create the final tools, all of which were engineered and executed by Milton Bradley or third-party tool makers that they employed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, fascinating. And just on those miniatures, actually, was it your decision or MB's decision or idea or Games Workshop to include the sort of some of those iconic monsters like the gargoyle or the Fimir? Do you remember where that came from?
So certainly the Fimir was something that Games Workshop were keen on, right? The
Right.
Fimir was a sort of like a monster that was of Games Workshop's creation.
Mm.
I originally had some additional sort of monsters in there, and Games Workshop were like, no, we should definitely have some Fimir. I can't remember exactly on the gargoyle. I had a larger. Uh, uh, I think it was a sort of like it was more of a sort of larger ogre. I think they were keen on the gargoyle. Again, it's got um, some strong sort of iconography about its design that fits with obviously a lot of Games Workshop characters at the time, and certainly the styling of the miniatures. These are unmistakably Games Workshop and Citadel miniature goblins and orcs, and that's really what it gave it. I think such a strong sort of visual sort of read.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the art as well, of course. And did the world of HeroQuest? I know it's not strictly speaking the Warhammer world, but was there also a push there from GW to sort of go, oh, well, you could mention this, or it could loosely tie into the Warhammer world?
Yeah, so I provided all of the written material to Games Workshop. Again, for them to be, um, sort of, experts in their sort of opinions and sort of to give input. And there were a whole, excuse me, a whole bunch of times when, understandably, Games Workshop sort of said, look, you're talking about a sort of like an unknown king here. This should really be, kind of Prince Magnus, or this should be, you're mentioning, this should be a place name that sits in the old world. And it it loosely felt like it fitted within the world of Warhammer, but not in a way that it was explicit. There is no discrete geography that the world of HeroQuest resides in within, the world of Warhammer. And in actual fact, some of the names got, swapped around a little bit, right? So I can, provide you some images. I have here my, my original sort of, rules and sort of dungeon layouts. This is all hand drawn, or mainly hand drawn, because again, back in the day, we had two computers in the department. It certainly wasn't the case that I had my own desktop computer. We had one dot matrix printer, so no one had Illustrator or Photoshop. I mean, it's like you're working with early sort of word processing programs, and I could use that for all of the written content, but for the maps themselves I used sort of painstakingly created the quest book map for a dot matrix printer, and then used that to hand draw in the individual configurations for the quests. And yeah, it was sort of interesting how we had to sort of develop back in those days.
Yeah, a lot of work, I'm guessing. Just a lot of painstaking work.
Yeah.
Amazing. And then so you put together HeroQuest, you've had that input and the elements that have come from GW. MB have invested a significant amount. It felt like there was a big push on the game as well, right? Was there quite a large investment in advertising and distribution of HeroQuest? Because obviously it was, there's the advert that was the famous advert that is it Christopher Lee doing the voice
Yeah.
on and things like that, right?
So I think that this is where momentum started to build, right? And again, I will caveat by saying that I was a passionate game player. I was someone who firmly believed that fantasy gaming and fantasy games were becoming better well known, even if they weren't more broadly played. It's like their existence had become popular. And in particular, we cannot underestimate the extent to which young minds had been open to the world of adventuring into a world of fantasy through fighting fantasy, right? I mean, back in those days, there wasn't a 10, 11-year-old, kid, particularly boys, who hadn't bought and played at least one fighting fantasy book. I mean, it was massive. It was Penguin's major book line. So when Hasbro or Milton Bradley, looked at, okay, so we're going to launch, a fantasy game. It's like, what do? Well, we do what we always do. We make a great TV advert. And, you're right. It's like it's a TV advert, the likes of which no one had ever seen before. And it immediately conjured up that world of adventure, fantasy gaming, again, not to take anything away from Games Workshop, but if someone who had read a fighting fantasy and knew nothing else about HeroQuest saw the HeroQuest advert, right, to them, it's evoking all of that same sort of classic sort of fantasy, sort of iconography and tropes and sort of ambience. And so it did meet with some early significant success. So much so that actually HeroQuest was the best-selling game the year it was launched, and did like 120,000 copies in the UK. And to put that in context, at the time, typically whatever you would sell in the UK, you'd multiply that by 10, and that would be the volume that you would expect in the North American market. So 120,000 units sold in the UK suggested that you could sell like 1.2 million of these in North America. And I remember speaking to salesmen at Hasbro in the early 1990s who basically were like, my bonus was so good because of HeroQuest. and so it was very successful. And that immediately swept away any reservations there were about doing further expansions. It immediately made the opportunity to sort of follow up with Space Crusade, which was, to all intents and purposes, you know, doing the Warhammer 40K equivalent of, HeroQuest. Um, and, it just opened the doorway to us doing a whole lot more.
Sure, yeah, I'll bet. I mean, that must have done wonders for your sort of standing as well. If this is the first sort of major game that you've developed for MB, and it's had that level of success.
Yeah, I mean, it gave me a lot of latitude. As I mentioned before, Roger Ford, who was, I mean, I worked for a guy called Howard Webster, who in turn reported to Roger Ford, who was the vice president overall of design. But Roger was very, very gracious, would always, give me his time, would always, he was a great cultivator of individuals. And and without doubt, the success of HeroQuest, gave me a lot of credibility internally. It also helped, and again, I'm not laying sole claim to this by any means, but it also helped. I think the European team, sort of say, hey, look, we can deliver new products and create new brand opportunities, independent of just localizing North American games. And it was also an interesting time because Hasbro was looking to sort of harmonize their European business. So um, up until that point, a lot of the products that were sold through Europe were somewhat exclusive or unique to each international market, right? So Germany had their line of what we called the 20 Deutschmark games, which was a sort of a line of, very affordable games. France, had a couple of their own unique games. And just from a manufacturing standpoint, having each country in Europe have their own product line was not cost effective, is not efficient. So there was a move towards having a more focused line that was universal across all European markets so that you got economies of scale for manufacture, return on investment for development, et cetera, et cetera. And HeroQuest was, came out at that point when that was very much the mindset. So again, fortune sort of played its part because the game was embraced across multiple, in fact, most of the European markets, which again led not only to the success that it had in the UK, but the success it had across, the rest of Europe.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious as well, actually, just around because obviously you talked about a bit of the development process that you went through for HeroQuest. There were other aspects of it that sound like they were quite unique to what you were doing, or that weren't as commonplace, like going out into schools and playtesting the game and stuff like that. Did it kind of prove the case for that sort of development process?
Yes, I mean, I think that, and again, I would not lay personal claim to sort of, being the only person who went out and did playtesting. Um, it it was more uncommon at the time, and I think that what I learned and what we as a development team increasingly realized is that there was more of an opportunity to go out and pressure test early design, whether that was in terms of the gameplay, the ability of people to, navigate the rules, whether it was early efforts in doing some um, sort of social pressure testing. I remember working on another game that I was just the sort of like the development assistant on, called Mysteries of Old Peking. And this was a game developed by or designed by Mary Danby. Great game, fabulous artwork. But within the game, it's got all of these Chinese characters, all of which have, sort of comical names. And we were concerned that, this might be something that would be frowned upon by, the Chinese community. So we went to the Chinese embassy and we presented the game and we sort of talked about it. And they laughed and they said, "Oh, we make these jokes all the time. This is like this is," and so what was interesting again, it was a very early example of a company taking a sort of a appropriate social consideration into factored into the early design process. So we would do that increasingly during the remainder of my time at Hasbro.
Right. Yeah. Almost like an early, I suppose you get sensitivity readers and things like that in sort of modern
Yeah,
games design, don't you?
absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. And again, quite rightly, with the lens of today, right? You can look back on HeroQuest and say there wasn't a female hero available, and it's true. And all I can say about that is, that was a sort of like a failure on my part, but it was also somewhat reflective of the time, right? It's like that just was, how people sort of, saw the opportunity as being more sort of boy focused, rightly or wrongly, because there were certainly female players in my role-playing group. But again, that's the kind of thing that in today's world we seek to be, not just mindful of, but to actually embrace a more, sort of diverse audience and to attract all players.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And then I'm just thinking about how the game continued to evolve and sort of and change. Obviously, there would be expansions, which we can get into, but for the US release of the game, because obviously it's come out and it's been a huge success in the UK. There's some tweaking and some changing that happens as it goes into the US market, right? So you change the intro quest and you change certain aspects of sort of elements of the game. I was curious about what drove that, and was that just, again, was that sort of playtesting, was that market research? What was sort of the reason for that kind of thing?
So I think I think there's a number of factors. One is there was certainly an opportunity in North America to basically learn from the lessons of the European launch, right? The European game came out the year prior. Um, that gave the US the opportunity to say, hey, it's worth investing a little bit more into this game because it's clearly something that is likely to succeed, right? We've got the track record in Europe to demonstrate that. Um, it was also an opportunity to go back in and say, we want to add some more flexibility to how we manage monsters and sort of future-proof this. So, adding in the hit points. And again, I had hit points early on in the game, and we kind of took those out, because we decided we were in Europe at least, we're going to make monsters tough by their ability to descend, but we defend, but we're going to keep the execution of the game clean by basically everyone, gets eliminated on one hit. And so there were a number of changes made, and the US certainly drove a lot of that. They redeveloped the first quest. As everyone famously knows, they changed Morcar to Zargon,
Yeah.
and that's created generations of intrigue and questioning. But but all of it, I think, was ultimately was for the benefit of the game. And then, of course, with the more recent relaunch, a lot of those adjustments have now become part of what is the global framework for the game.
Sure, yeah. So that was literally just the US team just like localizing it, I suppose. Then, right? It's even down to Morcar and Zargon is literally we think this name will play better for
Yeah,
our
and
audience.
and in all honesty, I can't remember specifically what the reason for the name change of Morcar to Zargon was Mike Gray, who was at the time the North American designer who was responsible for all of the adaptations for HeroQuest. He had come over to Europe even before we launched HeroQuest in Europe, right? So when the US got wind that we were developing a fantasy game, they said, well, we have a designer on our team who's ex-TSR, has worked on Dungeons and Dragons, we should send him over to not make sure that what you're doing is okay, but basically, again, to give the benefit of his experience and hindsight. And Mike Gray flew over and took a look at some of the early design, even before it got to the single game board. So again, there are some aspects of early HeroQuest game concepts that I've never spoken about, and I would be happy to kind of walk through some of those. Again, it sort of speaks to how I was trying to draw influence from what was happening in the marketplace and what I thought could be an opportunity that would further add to the appeal and the relevance for a fantasy game. So when the US were making those adjustments for when they launched HeroQuest, again, Mike was keeping me abreast of all of their thinking. We would chat regularly. Mike had been familiar with, the early development of the game and was also, kept up to speed on everything that we were doing with regards to the future expansions. My personal view with regards to Moor, knowing Hasbro as I do from later years, is it probably came down to something where it was just not as easy a name to legally protect. And so, therefore they came up with a name that was different and would give them, something that they could better protect and safeguard. Moor is actually a one of the arch nemesis is in my own role-playing world, and so there's a number of my own game characters and sort of elements that are most definitely a part of HeroQuest, including Ragnar. Ragnar was my role-playing character, and originally he became a prince, and was conferring missions on the heroes. And when that got changed to Magnus, I relocated Ragnar to be the unfortunate who needed rescuing in the second mission.
That's fantastic, though. So, and they're those characters in spirit as opposed to literally they connect in sort of continuity.
Yeah, it's really a kind of like in name only. I mean,
Right.
And maybe because my character Ragnar was a sort of like a sort of a troubled paladin. He was basically a D&D fighter who aspired to be a paladin but didn't have any of the paladin sort of capabilities, but tried his best to be one. But was far too willing to do whatever was necessary to really live up to paladin-like vows. So he was a flawed character, and certainly Ragnar, as people will have seen over the years, had some of those traits as well.
So, as the game progresses, you did work on a number of supplements and expansions, right? I mean, the first couple, Keller's Keep and the Witch Lord, they were, well, obviously there was new elements to that, but a lot of like repackaging of existing miniatures and kind of bulking out the offering. How did the development progress into the sort of the newer expansions with additional new miniatures?
So the first two expansions, I had very much wanted to put new miniatures in there, but that wasn't something that was viable. So we basically decided to offer a few more of the miniatures that you already had, which would at least change up certain ways in which we could execute a given quest, because now we had a larger number of monsters of a particular type to play with. It also importantly obviously gave us the opportunities for 2 new quest books. It gave us the chance to kind of begin to tell a little bit more of a light campaign narrative, and to provide additional content, right? Because I knew full well that if someone enjoyed the game, that you could play through the original quest book pretty quickly. Again, going back to what we discussed earlier, my sort of personal view that games should be something that you can personalize and customize right from the outset. Even in the base quest book, there's the center pages where you can design your own quest, and that was something I had to kind of campaign for, right? I mean, there was a lot of as you might appreciate, sort of opinions of like, why leave 2 pages essentially blank? Why not have another quest? It's like, because one other quest is another 60 minutes of joy. 2 blank pages that give you the chance to create your own quests is a lifelong opportunity, right? So, and again, we're before the internet, we're before people having home computers, so photocopying something and drawing in and writing up your own quest, much as I was doing, even designing them in the first place, allowed anyone who was playing HeroQuest to basically have the same tools that I had, and to create their own adventures.
Yeah.
But for the later quests, and again, this is where the early success of HeroQuest basically opened all doors, right? I mean, all of a sudden, concerns over how many, whether or not we should do additional expansions, the concerns over whether or not we could afford or whether it was worthwhile investing in new miniatures, all of that sort of went away in large part because everyone understood that there was, a strong business here to be had. It was also a business that still had that sort of tie ratio, right? So, there was still this element that expansions are great, but as everyone appreciates, better in today's world, the reality is your audience for an expansion is limited to the number of people who bought the base game. And so even though it had been very, very successful, that was just a fraction of the number of people who were available to buy an entirely new game. But, nonetheless, HeroQuest was a bit of a phenomena for at least its first 18 months in market, and that drove the velocity for new expansions.
On that, actually, I'm curious. Do you recall any of the sort of the numbers that we'd be talking about with regard to those expansions? Like, was it significantly smaller than the base game sales?
So the expansions were selling at around sort of like 30 to 40% of base game sales, which, to put it in context, oftentimes even a mass market game would do 40, 50,000 units in the UK. So the fact that we were getting sales for an expansion that were in line with what you might expect for a regular family game was sort of unheard of. And again, I think all sort of added fuel to the fire of people wanting to embrace not only more expansions but ultimately Space Crusade and then Battle Masters and what have you. So yeah, it was in that kind of ratio of about sort of like 30% of base game sales. That trailed off obviously over time, and ultimately, when you look at what happened with the whole line of products that Milton Bradley or Hasbro were launching in that fantasy genre, it got to a point where the phenomenon, had become less. People look to the next new thing. The sales, turned down a little bit, and Hasbro moved on, to sort of other lines, which is what happens. I mean, it's even in today's world, if you launch a game and you succeed, you've done well. If it succeeds into its second year, you've done really, really well. If it makes it to a third or fourth year, you're a rock star. Um, and if it stays in market forever, it's like you've achieved, the what everyone sets out to. So the fact that the fantasy games line ultimately sort of dwindled and sort of fell away, is the normal sort of passage of life for a game, certainly back in those days.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the US team managed to eke out a little bit more life, though, didn't they? They continued to produce some in-house supplements as well.
Yes, they created a couple of expansion packs that were never done in Europe. Um, they did do Battle Masters, but they did not do Space Crusade. Um, and again, I think that part of that was that Games Workshop and the world of Warhammer 40K was even less well known in North America at the time than it was in Europe. In the UK, it was a little bit more sort of well known. And I think the North American team basically decided that they would rather double down and continue to push on HeroQuest, than take Space Crusade. But that's my personal opinion, and kind of what I think is likely, the reality. Plus, again, I will go back to when Space Crusade was first seen at the London Toy Fair. The North American executives that came over didn't like the look of the box top, thought it was a little bit sort of grotesque, wanted the sort of the Geiger-esque imagery to be changed, which is why Space Crusade got its sort of famous second reprint sort of makeover. And that could also have factored into just there being a little bit of a negative view to Space Crusade as a product for the North American market. Again, I can't prove that. I know nothing to sort of say that that is the case. That's just the way I sort of interpret it.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, I mean, just thinking about Space Crusade then. So I assume this was pretty much the same setup when it came to developing Space Crusade that you had for HeroQuest. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I had sort of pushed forward with a lot of the design on Space Crusade. Games Workshop again committed to some very similar to what we had as the arrangement with HeroQuest, that they would manage all of the sculpts for the figures. They would manage a certain amount of internal art. And or Hasbro, Milton Bradley would manage everything else, and for the most part, I art directed that. So again, the box top illustrations, I sort of briefed out the game board illustrations, the wall sections, a lot of the art that ultimately went into like the mission books, I had done. I advocated strongly for the skeletal androids, and I advocated strongly for what became known as the dreadnought. And again, those were born from pop culture at the time, right? I mean, the androids clearly get their influence from Terminator, and the dreadnought clearly got its inspiration from Ed 209, from RoboCop. And Games Workshop were good enough to sort of go along with that, and to create some excellent miniatures. The other key component that I advocated for strongly was the interchangeability of weapons. So both on the Space Marine and the Dreadnoughts, I wanted ways to make customizing your squad or customizing your Dreadnought, as part of the experience, both with the physical models. And then particularly for the Space Marines in terms of how they choose their equipment at the beginning of a mission, which, again, I learned a lot from HeroQuest and the feedback that I got from players. Both I and Milton Bradley were more willing to embrace a little bit more depth of gameplay, which is why Space Crusade was really a sort of a step up in terms of some of the mechanic framework that exists within the game, particularly with the alien plague having a lot more sort of autonomy over how they deploy for a mission. The alien player in Space Crusade is much more of an active player versus a Morcar or a Zargon as a quest facilitator.
Yeah, and then they also, just in terms of like pure design innovations, I guess, you actually went back in a way to the tiles of the original HeroQuest, but on a sort of bigger scale. So you kind of created there's enough variability there because you can rotate those 4 different board tiles to create different layouts for your Space Hulk or the sort of game board. Was there a lot of other stuff that you were like that was almost in dialogue with HeroQuest where you were saying, okay, well, we did this time and I've learned this lesson and I want to do it in a different way for Space Crusade?
Yeah, I think so. There were definitely a number of factors. The Space Crusade board is kind of, as you point out, it's kind of the hybrid, right? Which is that at first glance, it kind of looks and feels like a game board because it's a regular shape and it's all laid out right from the beginning. But you've got 4 boards that can be orientated and organized in a number of different configurations. So right off the bat, you've got some flexibility whilst maintaining the square play area. But then you can also flick another switch and go, oh, but wait a minute, sometimes we can actually put them in a line of 3, and now I've broken the framework itself. So that was definitely one aspect. The other aspect was just wanting to give a little bit more agency, to all of the players. So having those additional choices, having a little bit more of a sort of a campaign progression and allowing the commanders to kind of upgrade and sort of unlock new capabilities, albeit in a very superficial way, right? I mean, there's no long, extensive campaign, but there's just enough that, again, players can be inspired by that to sort of, add and build out the game the way they want.
Yeah, and there was a lot of, it felt like there's a lot of flexibility and variability within the game. There are, even down to the fact that you've got different squads and you can take different squads and sort of approach it differently. It does feel like there's loads to choose from when you sit down to play it.
Yeah. And it's, and again, I, fondly sort of look back at the game because I felt like, for me personally, as a designer, that Space Crusade kind of gave, I felt like I was delivering a more in-depth experience with Space Crusade from a gameplay standpoint. And it's interesting because my sort of personal view on it is that I think that Space Crusade as a game is more robust. I think Space Crusade, has more rewarding set of game mechanics. But I think that HeroQuest provides richer narrative experience, right? So the missions in Space Crusade, I don't think achieved the same level of engagement and immersion that the quests in HeroQuest did. And it's, and it's a sort of, it's a subtle thing, and I don't know that I can fully explain it, but the reality is that years later, I do occasionally come across folks who speak, fondly of Space Crusade. I come across many, many, many more people who talk about HeroQuest and talk about HeroQuest because it opened a doorway for them to further immerse themselves into fantasy gaming. And again, I know that in today's world, Warhammer 40K in many ways has kind of surpassed sort of Warhammer Fantasy Battle and and the old world and and Warhammer fantasy. But I think that for many people, fantasy in the 90s and the early, sort of like 2000s, fantasy was the stronger genre. And I think that HeroQuest therefore spoke to that audience more strongly than Space Crusade did. And again, one man's view, right? It's like that's just how I look at the world. But the reality is, I do hear a lot more from folks who speak passionately about what playing HeroQuest meant to them and how it got them into role playing or Dungeons and Dragons than I do with Space Crusade.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, and I definitely think there's a theory worth exploring there, just around the impacts of fantasy and science fiction, especially in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, like you say. But I'm curious about from the sales side of things. Was Space Crusade as successful? Did it sell as many units as HeroQuest?
So I don't think Space Crusade was as successful. It certainly did well because Hasbro, Milton Bradley at the time, did not only, one expansion, they did several expansions, all of which unlocked sort of, new variations on the miniatures, right? So in the Dreadnought factory, whilst you got some more dreadnoughts, you also got like the super dreadnought. So there was some further expansion on the realms of what was possible with your dreadnought fabrication. And then, of course, you got the Eldar and stuff. So, so Space Crusade was certainly met expectations to sort of warrant the additional expansions. But in the same way that I think in the 90s, fantasy was the more dominant of the two genres, HeroQuest continued to outsell Space Crusade. And I think that has nothing to do with the quality of the game, the quality of the miniatures, the quality of the IP from which they draw inspiration. I think it was simply the fact that back then, fantasy was still what most people knew. Even when you look at fighting fantasy as a range of books, right? Vast majority of fighting fantasy books are fantasy based, not sci-fi based.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. And those expansions, though, I mean, some really fun stuff in there. But was there anything that sort of didn't make it out for HeroQuest as well, in terms of these were ideas or something that got into development on Space Crusade and HeroQuest that just it didn't make the cut?
So there were certainly some products that were sort of on the blueprint or under development. As you know, I left Hasbro in 1992, at which point the fantasy games line was still very much up and running. I had developed at that time a number of things, one of which was for Battle Masters. So Battle Masters came out in 1992. There were a couple of things that I'd been sort of pushing on. One was some new expansions for Battle Masters that would bring in new miniatures. So, as you might recall, similar to HeroQuest, there were two expansions that were done for Battle Masters that basically just gave you more miniatures. Because the way the game was designed is that you could have additional units for a given type, and that would just play out in exactly the same way, right? So there were no new miniatures because to some extent that would have required changing of the card art or some new card art or some new rules. So the first two expansions were just more of the same. What I wanted to do was something different. So I had looked at one expansion for the Forces of Chaos that would introduce a giant that would have its own special rules. Think of a supersized ogre. So a giant figure that would have some cards within the deck that would basically trigger the giant to work. That the giant would then have its own deck of cards. When triggered, it would, reveal a number of cards and it would do something. It was going to be a little bit easier to control, rather than the ogre that could be a little bit sort of random. And that actually, I've got the original 3-up model that was made. Now, obviously, you have to remember this figure's 3 times the size it would have been, but it would still have been, a miniature that would have been like, 6 inches tall. So it still would have towered above everything else in the game. And then for the Forces of Good, there was going to be an expansion that basically brought in some battle wizards that would have some, battle spells and sort of create a little bit of magic into the game. Unfortunately, neither of those came to market. They obviously fell by the wayside when Hasbro walked away from the fantasy line in general. I had also designed a Warhammer 40k version of Battle Masters, and this was played over a mat that was made up of Space Crusade like tiles. So, unlike Battle Masters, which had the big printed mat, I wanted to have a play surface that was a little bit smaller, but was more flexible in how each battle could be more unique, and therefore you could create more sort of unique missions for individual skirmishes. So it had these sort of 12-inch by 12-inch printed tiles that were arranged on a grid. I seem to remember it was a 5 by 5 grid, and a number of the tiles had sort of certain sort of scenery, whether it was craters, little sort of buildings that were made of card and plastic, similar to the fabrication of the furniture in HeroQuest. The kind of buildings that anyone who collected Airfix models back in the day and remember the ruined outpost, right? It's like, looked very much like that. It also included Gen 1 Land Raiders that were made of plastic parts molded side to side for the side of the Land Raiders, but the whole of the front plates in the Land Raider were again cardboard that was trapped in between. Because if you look at a Gen 1 Land Raider, most of the detailing is on the sides. The front plates, angles, and the tops is basically flat. So again, we had this Warhammer 40k early entry level battle system that again never saw the light of day because the arrangement with Games Workshop and ultimately the fantasy line in general sort of faded away in the mid-90s.
Wow, amazing. I mean, yeah, incredible to imagine what could have been there. I mean, was that all prototype stage, or did that get to any kind of miniature?
No, that was all prototype stage. So
Right.
at the time I was using, I always use a lot of proxies. So part of my design process has always been to create a prototype at all stages through development that is as close to what I envisaged the final product to be. And I do that by whatever means is necessary or possible. So, so back in the day, um, you know, I certainly didn't have sculpting modeling skills, right? The world of 3D modeling didn't exist. You know, there was no tabletop sort of, creative, tool suites. Photoshop and Illustrator were in their infancy and cost tens of thousands of dollars. So the way I fabricated is I would buy existing miniatures and I would kit bash bits of furniture, or I would, make up by buying commercially available floor tiles and photocopying them. I mean, even to the extent that color photocopying did not exist when I first joined Milton Bradley. And in Richmond, which has a number of offices and, is in a nice, London suburb and had some high-end firms, there was a photocopy center. Because again, back in the day, right, it's like no one had, few people had printers at home. If you did, it was a dot matrix printer. So if you wanted a good photocopy, you needed to be using a high-end office machine, or you would go to a photocopy center. And there was one round the corner from the Richmond offices that advertised that they had a full color photocopier, right? So I literally went to their opening party, cheese and wine, as they demonstrated what this full color photocopier could do, right? And I mean, it's quaint when you look back on it. It's like, but back in the day, it's like, this was unheard of. So, and it changed everything we did in design. I mean, back then, if you needed a quick color visual, someone somewhere was breaking out their Pantone markers and was doing you a marker rendering, right? And that needed real skill. And if you wanted another one, they would have to break out their Pantone markers again and do you another one, right? It's like, so suddenly being able to photocopy in color was a game changer. So again, when we look at those early games that ultimately never came to market, it was a lot of photocopying. It was a lot of cutting and pasting of existing artwork and patching it together. And, I know we've discussed, I'm going to be happy to share with you some imagery to some of this material. And I was literally using like, painter's masking tape to sort of like get nice lines, and then I'd go over to the photocopier and photocopy it, because I certainly wasn't generating all of that with state of the art software tools like Photoshop and Illustrator.
Sure. But then I guess maybe some of that resulted in the care and attention that made these things like built to last, right? That's one of the reasons they're still around, maybe.
It's key because again, I go back to what it is that inspires me, not only as a player but as a designer, right? So the look and the feel of the game is as important to me as any other aspect of the game. And I'm not saying that the gameplay is not important. The gameplay is critically important, but it does not exist by itself, right? It doesn't stand alone. And that is true, particularly when you look at sort of wargaming, right? It's like I can enjoy a book on wargaming and I can read a set of wargaming rules and I can love them for what they promise. But without a tabletop and without toy soldiers, they're nothing. So I can't have an experience without the balance of what makes that experience real. And even if I throw a bunch of unpainted models on the tabletop, and we've all done it, I've as guilty as anyone. Um, it's nowhere near as satisfying as having a tabletop filled with painted miniatures and cool looking terrain. So the reason that I prototype so comprehensively throughout the whole journey is I'm trying to understand whether or not the physicality of the product is delivering that part of the experience that it needs to. And I'm also trying to explore whether the physicality creates any insights in terms of other opportunities and or hindrances to gameplay, right? So simple things that I've learned as a gamer, right, as a war gamer. Um, is my table so big and fantastic that I can't reach the soldiers on the other side, right? Is this model so cool and awesome that it prevents me from seeing what's on the other side of it and I have to constantly move, which is fine if I'm wargaming, but if I'm playing a board game and I want to be sat down, all right, if something's blocking my view, I that could be a problem in terms of how I execute on the game. Um, likewise, does a physical miniature visually communicate what it is within the game, right? Is there intrinsic understanding between how something plays and what it looks like, right? So, and these are all things which, again, in today's world, I think there's far more sensitivity to. There's far, the world has become much more sophisticated. Many books have been written by highly experienced game designers about things to think about when you're designing games. And I don't want to take away from any of that, great knowledge, and I certainly don't want to take credit for any of that great knowledge either. But for me in my journey, that's always been a reality, right? Because I remember very well playing a game early on, where, I was sort of, well, two examples. One, playing a game early on where I was fielding some dragoon figures as light cavalry, and they are carrying their sort of their small carbines, and the player who was working alongside me rightfully assumed that they must have range, right? They must be able to shoot. It's like they've got guns, and it's like, oh no, these are operating as light cavalry, and they don't have guns, and it's an easy thing, it's an easy mistake to make, but the reality is the miniatures were not conveying
Mm.
intuitively what they can do within the game, and that can create confusion. Um, it's also interesting because I go back to a very early playtest where my far more intelligent friend taught me how to play chess. And we were lying on the floor and we were playing chess, and my parents were in the same room, and were highly, impressed that I was learning chess at such a young age. Um, and then I won the game, and I was thrilled. At which point my friend said, "Well, you can't do that because in order to be able to take me, when you moved into a position where you could take, the king, you needed to tell me that you were in check." So again, an early lesson where it was like, well, wait a minute. A, he forgot to explain the rules to me because he didn't explain about check. And secondly, my first thought as a young player was, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's like I have to tell you that I'm about to win.
So, I mean, I guess one final thought, Stephen, is just around, we talked about these things being built to last, and there's a lot of work went into the creation of HeroQuest, and it did incredibly well. Then it sort of dropped off, as you said. Now it's back, and we're however many decades later, and it's still talked about. Even the original still holds so much magic for so many people. I mean, that must feel really good as just a creator and a game designer to know that you've had such an impact on so many players.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very sort of humbled by the number of people who reach out to me and just, want to share their story of, how they got into fantasy gaming by playing HeroQuest when they were a kid, or how they found their old copy of HeroQuest and played it with their kids and kind of reconnected with that experience. Um, you know, I certainly never set out to, kind of create uh, that sort of phenomenon. I mean, I was just a guy who was passionate about games, who wanted to design a game that was the kind of thing that I thought would be exciting, and had all of the key elements that have inspired me. Um, but I've increasingly become mindful of the fact that, anything and everything we do has the opportunity to become momental in someone else's life. And certainly with some of the games I've designed, and HeroQuest in particular, um, that has proven to be really true. And I always try to find the time to respond to fans when they reach out. I occasionally dip into various fan sites, and if someone's posted, their newly painted HeroQuest miniatures, I might drop them a sort of a thumbs up or a quick comment. Um, and then in particular with the relaunch, and again, Hasbro were tremendous. I mean, I really value the fact that they were not required by any means to reach out to me and give me a sense of what was going on. They were certainly not compelled to have me, write a bonus quest book, but they did. And I welcome that opportunity. The ability to kind of go back and revisit something that I did 35 years ago was awesome, particularly given the fact that I could do so using the full suite of modern tools and capabilities, right? So, the fact that I could design a quest working on my desktop computer and I could basically create a finished result was awesome. Um, and I also think it was great that the new game was such a strong homage to the original product, right? The fact that it clearly, replicated in a very sort of modern style, the look and the feel of the original game. And again, I've seen and I've heard from many people who love the fact that, it brings back all of those memories, because it is just such a strong visual cue to what everyone fondly remembers.
Yeah, very much does. But there's a lovely balance between the nostalgia and the modernity of it. Taking the best of what we
Exactly.
can do now and retaining the best of what was done previously. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I must admit, I'm one of those gamers who that was my first stepping stone into gaming. So from HeroQuest and Space Crusade into Warhammer and everything else. So I owe you a great deal of thanks. But
Hey, I
thank you as
appreciate
well
that.
for joining me and talking just about so much amazing work that you've done, Stephen. It's been a real joy.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you for everything that you do to tell the history of games and to bring those stories to folks who are interested. I think it's fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Enormous thanks to Stephen for joining me and chatting so much about so many amazing games and his incredible philosophy on game design. All of that stuff was absolutely awesome to hear and to explore. So thank you so much. If you would like to hear even more from Stephen Becka about the rest of his career, the creation in more detail of Battlemasters and Havoc and Heroscape, then you can listen to a second interview that is currently available right now for my Patreon supporters. That interview will make its way onto the Jordan Sorcery Pods channel eventually, but for now you can only listen to it at my Patreon. And there is also some exclusive content coming to the Patreon as well, a couple of other conversations and stories with Stephen, that didn't make it into the 2 retrospective interviews. And that is not all, because Stephen Becka and Boss Fight Studios have given me unprecedented exclusive access to the behind-the-scenes making of Stephen Becka's latest board game. That game is going onto Kickstarter very soon. Saurozoic Warriors is the name, and it is about dinosaurs in gladiatorial combat. It sounds really, really fun. There is some awesome stuff to it, and we go through the full process from conception to prototyping to iteration to Kickstarter launching, and how all of that comes together to create a brand new game. It is a fascinating story, and that development diary will be starting on the Jordan Sorcery channel on YouTube very soon indeed. Thank you once again to Stephen for being such an amazing guest. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.